You're listening to Simply Put, a podcast from FHN Financial. I'm your host, Will Comperl. President Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBBA, into law last week, extending the biggest tax cuts implemented in his first term, cutting support to Medicaid and green energy investment, and increasing spending on defense and immigration enforcement. The law's supporters believe it will encourage enough investment and growth to offset any new shortfalls in revenue, while the law's detractors believe it irresponsibly widens the federal budget deficit. On today's episode, we talk with Rachel Snyderman, Managing Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, about the OBBBA's most important provisions, how the new law will impact federal deficits, and the importance of economic dynamics in determining the budget trajectory. Stay tuned. Coming up soon, our interview with Rachel Snyderman, but first, a quick market update. Last week's June jobs report showed top-line numbers stronger than consensus expectations, but there was material weakness in the details. Half of the overall growth in payrolls came from government workers, particularly state and local government education, that was most likely a seasonal adjustment issue. The 4.1% unemployment rate reflected a large decline in labor force participation, rather than fewer unemployed people finding work. Nonetheless, the report was good enough to encourage Fed officials to almost certainly keep policy on hold later this month. President Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act on July 4th, the subject of today's episode. Because the bill's broad contours were apparent early in the legislative process, financial markets had largely priced in the deficit and economic impacts by the time the bill was signed into law. The jobs report and some other strong labor market data caused treasuries to sell off over the last 2 weeks, bringing 10-year yields as high as 4.43% after falling as low as 4.19% on July 1st. Bonds had rallied throughout the end of June after Fed Governors Chris Waller and Mickey Bowman expressed support for policy easing as soon as the July meeting. The bond market is now fully pricing in the next rate cut at the October 29th meeting, with just over 2 cuts priced in by the end of this year. The minutes from the Fed's June meeting were released this week with few surprises. Most of the FOMC feels policy is well positioned to adjust to any inflection points in price pressures or the labor market, and the majority are comfortable exercising patience to see the impact of tariffs on inflation before they telegraph any future rate cuts. The exceptions, though not mentioned by name, were Governors Waller and Bowman. The 90-day pause in reciprocal tariffs announced by President Trump back on April 9th ended this week. With only a couple of trade deals finalized, the president opted to send letters to foreign leaders dictating new terms for bilateral trade with an August 1st start date. The president also announced a new 50% tariff on copper imports this week. That's all for the market update this time. Now our interview with Rachel Snyderman. Our guest today is Rachel Snyderman, Managing Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Rachel, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our topic today is the budgetary impact of the spending bill recently made into law, officially called the One Beautiful Bill Act. Now, I think there is understandable confusion about this fiscal package's budget impacts, whether we should compare it to existing policy or existing law, what economic growth we should assume, what interest rates will be, and all of that is important, and we will get into them a bit later. But for now, Rachel, our audience is very interested in the amount of debt the federal government is going to have to issue to make up that shortfall between revenues and outlays each year. So, the deficit was $1.7 trillion in fiscal year 2023 and $1.8 trillion in 2024. Now that this bill has become law, what is the deficit estimated to be this year, in 2026, and in 2027?
Well, it's a great question. And Nick, to your opening remarks, you left out one adjective there, and it was big. This is a one big, beautiful bill. And I think the emphasis there on big is, of course, yes, the deficit impact. The Congressional Budget Office has projected that OBBB, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, will increase deficits by $3.2 trillion over the next 10 years. If we're thinking about that in the context of our fiscal outlook, you rightly cited those estimates. Aside from the passage of this package, is that right now we are staring down a potential $2 trillion deficit this year, and over the next 10 years, really averaging 2.5 annual deficits. That's about making up about 6% of our GDP each year. And so those are really big numbers, hard to comprehend, but especially when you're kind of thinking about what we as a nation prioritize our spending on and where it goes towards. I mean, the amount that we need to borrow to be able to finance this $2 trillion annual deficit, that's creating interest costs of about $1 trillion per year. That's more than we spend on national defense, on Medicaid. And so you're just kind of putting these numbers into context, the enormity of kind of the situation that we're in already, just aside from the passage of this big bill, is really important. But then when we're looking at, the passage of this piece of legislation, the deficit impact is real. That is comprised of about $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, about $300 billion in new spending, primarily on border security and the military, and then some notable offsets in there to be able to afford the bill, as I know we'll talk in more detail, primarily looking at some social safety net programs like Medicaid and student loan financing.
I think you make a really good point. Not only is this deficit so big as a percentage of GDP, but also, even for the last couple of years, but now estimated onward, this is way past the pandemic. It's during peacetime. It's not a recession. We are set to have huge annual deficits for the foreseeable future. And like you said, we're going to address a lot of those topics in just a bit, but I do want to talk about the debt ceiling. So earlier this year, the Treasury started to undergo what they call extraordinary measures to avoid breaching the debt ceiling. With this new law, what changes are there to the debt ceiling? When do they go into effect? And do we have to go through another one of those exhausting debt ceiling showdowns anytime soon?
Great question. Something that I spend a large amount of my time on is thinking about these debt limit impasses and what the federal debt is. It is interesting that the federal debt limit was raised through this process. Now, the reconciliation process allowed Republicans to fast track this legislation in the House and the Senate. Because they used the reconciliation process, they were able to include a debt limit increase in that bill as well. Notable because this is something that is traditionally needed bipartisan support to do. But what the bill did was raise the debt ceiling that was reached previously this year at $36.1 trillion. The bill provided an increase of $5 trillion to the debt limit. So now we're looking at a debt limit of $41.1 trillion. Pretty significant when you think about kind of the growth of the debt that we have accumulated over the past 10 years and really since the turn of the century when we entered the century with a surplus. But I think when we're thinking about how, with the borrowing costs that we're staring down in the coming years, and if we are averaging about $2 trillion annual deficits, likely to see this debate come back up in a not too distant future, maybe after the midterm elections next year. But this is definitely going to be a debate that will come back to lawmakers maybe late 2027 or earlier the following calendar year. A lot of that is rests on the state of the economy, of course, legislative changes that go into effect from here until then, but certainly something that we will be continuing to look out for and that the Bipartisan Policy Center does an extraordinary amount of work on. But definitely a negotiation that, as we all too familiar with, we're just kicking the can down the road as opposed to really dealing with our fiscal challenge or creating a better mechanism through which we need to not flirt potentially with default the U.S. economy.
Under the 2017-2018 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a lot of provisions were scheduled to sunset at the end of this year. And this has caused some confusion with the budget estimates because I think there was a general assumption that neither party was going to let all of those tax cuts entirely lapse. But still, the law did say they would not continue past this year. So in this way, my understanding is the biggest cost of this year's spending bill was extending TCJA's tax cuts. What are the biggest provisions here that are staying the same as they have been since 2017-2018?
Yeah, that's correct. A big chunk of the cost of this bill is doing just that, extending policies that were put into place in 2017 and in some places extending them a few years, in some places making them permanent policy. When we're looking at the big drivers of that cost, they're primarily in extending lower individual income tax rates. Those tax rates were lowered across the board in 2017, now have been extended permanently in the OBBBA. Another is the doubled standard deduction. This was also made permanent and boosted, actually, this latest legislation for both married and single filers. Another major provision that has grabbed a lot of headlines, of course, coming out of the pandemic was the expanded child tax credit. Actually, before there were temporary expansions put into place in the height of the pandemic, TCJA had doubled that credit. What the current legislation that just passed does was make that permanent, but also provide a $200 boost per child in 2025. And so now we're looking at kind of following that, a permanent $2,000 per child tax credit. There are some other provisions that kind of help make up that calculus, but those, I would say, are some of the primary ones that we have been hearing about in the press, certainly that we saw lawmakers react to, especially as they were looking for, maybe some potential ways to curb the costs and maybe not extend, for example, all of the individual income tax rate cuts. But eventually what was done was actually to extend many of these provisions and in some places even boost them, like we saw with the standard deduction and the child tax credit.
When I've seen a chart of the costs of this spending bill, that renewal of TCJA takes up a huge chunk of it, but there are some new tax cuts. What are some of these? We heard a lot on the campaign trail. Are they really a drop in the bucket compared to what you just talked about, or are there some important things to keep in mind when it comes to budget deficit impact?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. We saw, what I think is really fascinating from a political standpoint, policy standpoint, is that, yes, this bill not only codified, major tax elements of TCJA over the president's first term, but also put into law several campaign priorities. We see, for example, there are provisions for no taxation on tipped income for individuals of a certain income and certain occupation, an increased deduction for seniors to kind of get at the president's campaign promise to eliminate taxes on Social Security. There is a new deduction to eliminate taxation of overtime. And so, again, for individuals under certain income threshold and occupation, also deduction for car loan interest. And so these are all campaign priorities that we heard discussed at length throughout the campaign, now made permanent. But what's really interesting is that, again, a kind of the affordability piece of the bill is that these provisions are put in place through the entirety of the president's term. They then expire. And so that creates now a cliff for lawmakers in 2028 and 2029, where they're going to have to go back to the drawing board and decide, again, are these policies that good fiscal sense? There's going to be a lot of political pressure, I imagine, depending on the ultimate success and if taxpayers really feel the direct economic benefit that they provide. But it is interesting to kind of see when we look at the alphabet soup now of tax policy that is created in this bill, some items made permanent, some items made temporary that can create enormous complexity, honestly, for folks who are sitting around the kitchen table trying to file their taxes each year. But interesting to note that these policies are coming into effect immediately this tax year so that folks can, feel the benefit of them. And, I think we'll have to kind of see where that debate goes from here.
I want to talk a little bit more about the magnitude of those cuts you just talked about, because I remember reading about the provision for the tax deductions for tipped workers or working on overtime. And, they set certain parameters that don't make all that many people eligible. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that a lot of tipped workers don't owe federal income tax anyway, and this wouldn't apply to their FICA taxes. So are these new tax cuts, they sound really good, like they're delivering for, working class people, but actually it's not going to make all that much of a difference, which means it's not going to make all that much of a difference on our budget deficit.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk right now about the distribution impact, the distribution tables and impacts of the various provisions. I think on some of these provisions that are new tax policies, this is really where we're going to be looking to the Treasury Department as they're going to be putting out regulations as soon as possible, because some of these provisions like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, folks will be eligible to claim them this tax year when they file in the spring, which is, if you think about kind of the enormity of the task that's then put on Treasury to write these regs, it's pretty incredible. I think we have to really see, in real time, come next year, how this is impacting the bottom line of folks. And yes, a lot of questions right now about when tax policy is designed. You always want to make sure that you are treating folks of the same income, for example, fairly. Kind of the principle that we talk about in tax policy is adhering to horizontal equity. Also that we are obtaining vertical equity so that there's some progressivity in the tax code so that, for example, folks who are making more money are taxed at a higher rate than those less. So it'll be really interesting to see next filing season how those principles are adhered to or not, when we really see how folks are filing their taxes and what deductions, new or existing, they are claiming.
Another frequent source of disagreement regarding these budget estimates is how the economy will respond to the policies. So we can count up all the changes to taxes and spending, but of course, some of them are better for economic growth than others, and this is what is called dynamic scoring. So the law's proponents say GDP growth will accelerate to offset a lot of the revenue impacts from tax cuts. What do you and the Bipartisan Policy Center estimate for economic growth over the next few years because of these policies? Because if a lot of this law was renewing pre-existing tax cuts, do you assume that there aren't really any new pro-growth incentives and we're just continuing on the status quo, or am I missing something?
So it's really interesting here because we have to bifurcate kind of some of the individual changes to the code to the corporate changes in the code. For example, some of the major corporate provisions in here, such as extending bonus depreciation and full of research and development expensing for companies. The bill maintains the corporate income tax rate at 21%. Those are some pretty major policies that the business community has been looking for, that were actually changed in TCJA, that the legislation just passed, made permanent. Those actually, I think, are ones where the business community is really looking at, like, that's where the juice is worth the squeeze, making some of these major business tax incentives permanent policy because they help businesses plan for their future investments and innovation. Providing that level of certainty is really important for tax planning and ultimately for economic growth. I think that you're correct on the individual side, especially because we saw rate extension in some places, increase in some of the provisions on the individual side. We don't necessarily see the same economic feedback on individual tax provisions as we do on the business tax provisions. So it'll be interesting to see, how those are reflected. The macroeconomic environment cannot be displaced from just the kind of the modeling of the potential impacts of this bill, right? We have trade and tariff policies that is ongoing as negotiations are advanced each and every day. And so I think that is also something that will be playing into the conversations about economic growth. And so, we also have more insecurity, I think, at the geopolitical level that, of course, also plays into the investment decisions of businesses. And so there's a lot of moving pieces here in a global economy. But yes, I think that your point on, the importance of understanding the difference between static and dynamic scoring, and also taking that dynamic scoring with a grain of salt, because again, we're trying to model isolated changes to a bill could implement with, in a much bigger, more complex economy that has a lot of moving pieces. But certainly a welcome change to see some of those business provisions included in there permanently, and we'll have to kind of see what economic feedback those deliver in real time.
You mentioned the tariffs, and they were not included in this law, as far as I can tell. But do they factor into your budget estimates or when the CBO does it? I know that the CBO, from requests, I believe from Chuck Schumer, estimated tariff policy that was in place as of mid-May would contribute $3 trillion in revenues over the next decade. We're talking about some real money there. That's going to make a pretty big difference in deficits. So why are tariffs independent of these analyses? And how should we think about them when we're thinking about the deficit over the next few years?
Yeah, and they're independent because, they were not included as part of the legislative piece of this bill. The president has the authority to implement and exercise the implementation of tariffs and to change it through those trade negotiations that are ongoing. It is really interesting to see the estimates that are coming out right now. As of today, we've seen from calendar year to date about $100 billion in tariff revenue come in the door. That's pretty significant, especially as we're seeing that compared to previous years. It's about almost double than what we've seen. And so, certainly tariff revenue is coming in. However, I think we have to also, when we're thinking about the 10-year impact, that you cited, for example, we have to think about the political rationale for and the policy rationale for these tariffs being put in place. For example, if they are to bring countries to the negotiating table, well, then we might see some of that tariff revenue rightly decrease over that time if they really are intended to begin negotiations to then incentivize, stronger trading agreements with various partners. And so I do think that that's where we are likely to see variability through the end of this year, let alone through the 10-year window. But, I think when we have to kind of take a step back and just think about the amount of money that tariffs do generate, total federal revenues in 2024 made up 17% of GDP. Tariff revenue made up 0.3% of GDP. So, we also have to remember with a grain of salt that we derive a very small amount of our revenue at the federal level from tariffs. So I think, any kind of conversation about that, replacing the income tax, for example, or offsetting the cost of this legislation or other legislation to come, we have to kind of take that with a grain of salt and really think about, again, the purpose of what these tariffs are intended to achieve and also the historical role that tariffs have played in generating federal revenue.
Yeah, I think that is certainly some important context. Throughout the debate of this bill going between the House and Senate, and as everyone tried to get their favorite provisions inserted and removed, we heard a lot about the $8.99 so-called revenge tax. What was this all about, and did it make it into the final law?
A lot about the revenge tax, a lot about the state and local tax deduction, two totally different tax policies. And I'm glad that you asked about the revenge tax, Section 899 as it became kind of known inside the Beltway here in DC. But this was a tax that was included in the House version of the bill. So kind of before it got over to the Senate and negotiated, the House had put this in there. And it was really designed, it was a retaliatory tax that was not designed to impose on countries that put into place the United States considers unfair or discriminatory taxes against U.S. companies or individuals. Now, kind of think about the digital services taxes, for example, that we saw kind of in the news over the past coming weeks between Canada and the United States. These proposed tax hikes would have applied to foreign individuals and businesses who are earning income in the United States. What the provision did in the House was it actually spurred some additional conversations that were actually already ongoing between the Treasury Department and the G7, who ultimately then made the request of Congress to drop this provision because of the productivity of the conversations that were happening between the U.S. and the G7. And a lot of this kind of goes back to some of the broader conversations that the U.S. has engaged with the OECD for a number of years as they are really working to overhaul the entirety of the international tax regime and ensuring that there are fair and consistent tax practices being put into place at the international level. It did come down to the G7 countries agreeing to exclude U.S. companies from certain taxes imposed under this OECD tax agreement. And the U.S. government found that that was a good faith agreement. The Secretary of Treasury, Secretary Bessent, made this request of Congress to ultimately drop this provision. Where we see that going from here, I think that there's still a lot of work to be done on this international tax agreement. And certainly the digital services taxation debate and discussion is not going away. Several countries do have these taxes, but interesting to see that this was something that was very strong out the gate. A lot of companies responded. A lot of folks, obviously, in the administration, keenly aware and working on this provision. And then ultimately, we saw it drop from the bill.
You mentioned also the SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction. What happened in the final version of the law? I know this was a big sticking point for Republican House members in blue states. What happened? How did it end up, and what are the new costs compared with prior years?
Yeah, this is the beauty of Washington. I mean, this is like where deals get made. The SALT provision has been a sticking point of Democrats and Republicans in high tax states for the past 8 years. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA, had put into place this $10,000 cap that was due to expire in 2025. And that was essentially capping at $10,000 per household the amount that individuals could deduct from their state and local tax liability. What the bill that just passed, OBBBA, did was it increased that cap to $40,000. Importantly, there were a lot of negotiations about folks in these jurisdictions wanting that cap to either be eliminated, wanting that cap to be increased at a higher level. But kind of where the compromise landed was at this $40,000 cap, and also that there was a $500,000 income threshold put on, whereby both the cap and the income threshold could increase by 1% each year through 2029. Now, what's interesting, though, is that, as we've talked about kind of what's temporary, what's permanent in this bill, the SALT cap at this higher level of $40,000 actually expires in 2030. And it reverts back to that $10,000 cap that was put back into place in 2017. So, certainly a temporary win for a number of these folks whose constituents this was the top tax issue for them to come to Washington to fight over. But that debate just, again, got kicked down the road because we'll be back here right back in 2029 having the exact same debate. And, very interesting as we kind of think about the different layers of caucuses and political groups on Capitol Hill. This is one where you have, obviously, of course, the divisions between party, but you also have the divisions between high tax states, low tax states. You have the divisions between, even different jurisdictions within those states. So, really interesting to see the politics of this all play out as we saw in the past weeks, months, and years.
The biggest cut in spending in this law was to Medicaid expenditures, which is healthcare provided to lower income people where costs are shared to some extent between states and the federal government. What are the new cost savings from these Medicaid cuts in the budget? And through what channels does the federal government arrive at those savings?
We saw a large amount of changes introduced for Medicaid. We're talking about $1 trillion in those savings being attributed to some of these changes to the Medicaid program. But interestingly, these changes don't go into effect until January of 2027. So this is actually after the midterm elections next year. Yeah. Right. So, again, the importance of, when you mix policy and politics, you get some interesting results. Some of the major changes that we will see rolled out are imposing some new Medicaid work requirements, reducing some Medicaid eligibility based on legal status for some states, or based on legal status for states, requiring more frequent eligibility determinations. As you and I were kind of discussing before for the podcast, how those eligibility determinations might increase, paperwork and compliance costs for states, certainly something to be thinking about. Also restructuring the Medicare provider tax collection and redistribution. This will have some fiscal impacts for states. Certainly that, of course, this is a program that is a cost sharing program between the federal government and the states, where both sides are responsible for contributing to ensure that there are folks continue to get care. Kind of thinking about the magnitude of these changes, again, I think important to note that this was the main area where the House and the Senate looked to cost savings, but also too, because of when these changes go into effect in 2027, you're really putting the onus on this implementation to a future Congress. The politics in early 2027 could look very different depending on the results of the midterm elections. And so, it puts a lot of uncertainty, frankly, on the side of states, not only from a fiscal standpoint, but of course, an implementation standpoint and a compliance standpoint as well.
I want to apply that idea of dynamic scoring that we talked about earlier to these Medicaid cuts, because I think that here, too, there are some questions of how the actual savings could differ from the estimates on paper. The work requirements and paperwork that you talked about historically leave out people who qualify. So we can think about, okay, there's this percentage of the current Medicaid enrollees that do not qualify, and so they will be excluded from benefits in coming years. But I think that some people will find the paperwork too burdensome, too confusing. They won't know they have to do it. Is it possible that Medicaid savings could be higher than estimated just because it excludes more people than the bill estimates?
It certainly could. I think that's where there are a lot of studies that I know are getting well underway as we speak to really understand the magnitude of this and the behavioral economic implications that these compliance measures will add, but also to get around that, where states might also ultimately put more money towards investing into ensuring that folks don't lose that coverage. A lot of work to be done there, and I think exactly to your point. I mean, this is why the scoring of these bills and understanding them from a static and dynamic perspective is so interesting, but also how critical this modeling is for states at this moment, because they will be really tasked with grappling with these changes. And they're the ones who are on the ground responsible for helping folks get the assistance that they need. They're working with their local program officers and their local departments of health and human services. They're not necessarily kind of thinking about, nor should they think about kind of the connections to the changes in federal policy. And of course, we're talking about policy that's going to be going into effect a year and a half down the line. None of that matters when you need medical care coverage today and right now for a major medical expense, when a provider needs to be reimbursed for providing that care to an individual in need. So I think certainly, a lot of questions that will remain for local hospitals, especially rural hospitals, as we saw come out in the debate, and a lot of planning that's going to be taking place already on behalf of states and medical providers to ensure that they can provide adequate care to those who need it most.
Now, another part of the dynamic approach is on the flip side. So, U.S. hospitals are required to some extent to treat people in emergencies, even if they're uninsured. So, if these Medicaid cuts end up being more costly than estimated, could they? Because treatment for the uninsured gets cycled back to taxpayers to some extent, whether it's through higher premiums or the hospitals have to eat it through lower margins. Could these Medicaid cuts end up actually being less cost-saving than we see on paper?
Yeah, I certainly love the way you think because I think just kind of making it clear that all of these costs are connected, and that whenever we are talking about changes in policy, there are always perverse incentives and unintended consequences, for good or for bad, that maybe policymakers haven't thought through. And you're exactly right. If we are putting into place, for example, policies that could increase medical care costs, at the margin, what then is that, that has major fiscal implications. Of course, it also has implications for the number of hospitals that are able to remain open to provide such care. And if that doesn't happen, then you're potentially having folks or medical services have to travel a greater lengths to be able to get folks to the care that they need. That, of course, has cost implications as well. And so, there is always this dynamic feedback, but it happens at both the micro and the macro levels. And, I don't think that, especially as we're talking about the fastest growing part of the federal budget is what we spend as a nation on healthcare. Certainly, of course, an area that we need to look at modernization and cost containment, but one in which, I think certainly at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we've always thought that this is a conversation that needs to happen with folks on both sides of the aisle at the table, because that's really how you promote durable policies that truly work for every single American.
You mentioned the new rural health fund. I think it's for rural hospitals. Do you think that could help cushion these costs and keep some of the rural hospitals open? I know, I believe it was Maine Senator Susan Collins that really lobbied hard for this. Is that going to make much of a difference? How much will it cost? Is it, just a drop in the bucket when we're talking about expenditures over 10 years?
I think that it's important to note, as you say, this was an area where there was rightly some concern on both sides of the aisle to ensure that this fund was justified to be able to really meet the needs of rural hospitals and not to create the kind of that financial cliff that could exist. Now, can this help? Certainly, in the beginning years as this is put into place, as these policies are rolled into place in 2027 and beyond, I have every reason to believe that it will provide, that initial financial cushion. How long that can take, and then of course, then you get into legislating for future Congresses. Does that fund need to be replenished? Does policy need to change? You're again kind of creating this system whereby perhaps, those billions of dollars are whittled down. There's, of course, then going to be a lot of political pressure on behalf of lawmakers to replenish it and ensure that, the rural hospitals in their districts or in their states don't close. So you're creating then complexity because you're creating new systems, but then you're also creating kind of potentially the opportunity to keep funding these types of programs and policies, on autopilot or increase them. And so instead of you're kind of almost like putting a Band-Aid on the problem, as opposed to having a really comprehensive solution for, as a nation, for example, how do we get, a healthcare system under control? So, a lot of kind of policy questions, baked into there, but, of course, all made very complicated when you think about the politics that we're going to run into, just a few years down the line.
I look at interest rates for hours every day. and I will tell you that predicting the 10-year Treasury yield a year from now is difficult to do with much precision. But I believe you mentioned after my first question that interest payments on the debt are now exceeding defense spending. So this is a really big part of our budget. What assumptions in the estimates that we've talked about for the deficit and costs and everything were made about interest rates and Treasury's debt service payments over the next few years, next 10 years? Do you assume Treasury continues its current debt issuance profile? They've been really relying on Treasury bills more than longer-term debt. So there are a lot of assumptions that go into projecting our debt service payments. What do you put as the baseline?
The debt service costs of this legislation is a really important point. When we're thinking about a bill that $3.2 trillion on net to the deficit over the next 10 years. When we're thinking about adding the interest expense of that debt, the cost rises to over $4 trillion in 10 years. We saw that the Congressional Budget Office came out and estimated that the additional debt service costs under this bill would be $551 billion over 10 years. And when we're kind of thinking about the interest rates over the next 10 years, what CBO has also come out with and estimated is that just a 10 basis point increase in interest rate above current estimates sustained over 10 years would add another $300 billion to the deficit. So I think the point that you raise is like the variability that we're seeing is what investors are demanding is really telling. To see kind of the economic volatility, maybe the most powerful economy in the world shouldn't be facing. That's really important. But then also to just see the sensitivity in the potential increase of interest rates over the next 10 years and what that will do to our debt servicing costs cannot be underscored enough, because these have direct implications for what we're able to, the fiscal space that's available for the United States to spend money and to where we prioritize, what we want to spend money on. If it really is that we want to continue borrowing to, and for interest costs to, it's the fastest growing part of the budget. If that's really going to start to eclipse even what we spend on healthcare and soon to be Social Security, I think we have to ask some really tough questions.
10 basis point increase costing $300 billion. I mean, that is really interesting to put into perspective, and just shows, I think, how many wild cards there are in terms of estimating the deficit
Yes.
over the next 10 years. You have interest rates, maybe tariff revenues, economic growth is always a wild card. But it's always helpful to think of those things in context. I want to end with a question. What do you think is the most underappreciated aspect of this budget? All of, like you said, this is mixing policy and politics. So, of course, people might focus on the most scandalous, most dramatic changes that don't actually impact the budget or economic growth all that much. So what would you say is flying under the radar the most that you think is very important that people aren't paying enough attention to?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, it's one that we've spent a lot of time here at BBC thinking about, because when we kind of review the bill on merits, yes, the fiscal outlook is extraordinarily concerning. And that's, a top point that I do think is underappreciated in terms of the fact that we really, as a nation, we are on autopilot when it comes to really addressing this very serious issue. And it's one where lawmakers need to start now thinking about, it's too late really, but they need to really start thinking about prioritizing our debt and deficit and getting those under control, as opposed to doing the easier thing in Washington, which is, of course, is cutting taxes or increasing spending. And as you said earlier, especially during a peacetime, an era relative peacetime. But, another less appreciated aspect of this bill is that there are actually a significant amount of policies that were included that had strong bipartisan tenets. I mean, Democrats, while they did not vote for this bill, certainly have long supported increases to the child tax credit, maintaining lower individual income tax rates for lower income quintiles. We saw no taxation on tips pass the Senate unanimously earlier this year. So these are some provisions that have long been championed by both sides of the aisle, and some of which were packaged, in this bill. And so, certainly even the extension of tax provisions that help employers provide paid family and medical leave and affordable childcare. So, while again it was a partisan exercise, ultimately a partisan bill, and one will be a crowning achievement of the second Trump administration. Certainly some elements of policies there that might be more durable. Even on the business side as well, with the provisions that were included there, such as full expensing for research and development and bonus depreciation. I'd say kind of where we're thinking about wild cards, or it's the fact that we are not nearly at the end of talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, because the bill includes so many temporary provisions, as it did, permanent. For example, we are going to see, a lot of kind of conversations about some of the clean energy tax provisions that are due to start to be eliminated or sunset, as we like to talk about, starting in this year in 2026, all the way through 2028. Some of those debates might get punted to a future Congress to continue to have those conversations, because we know that in the final hours, really, of the negotiations over the bill, there was a lot of concern on a bipartisan basis about the clean energy provisions and what was being done to those in the bill. A lot of, additional cliffs over policy provisions in here, such as, as they relate to Medicaid, as we discussed. And so, we are certainly not nearly at the end of talking about this bill. And of course, as we'll see, at the end of the president's term, many policy provisions that expire that were signature campaign promises that Congress is, a future Congress is going to then have to deal with, either allowing to expire or extending in some manner. But of course, that will come at a fiscal and a political cost, depending on kind of what the dynamics of Capitol Hill look like then. So always something fun to look forward to. And, here in Washington, if you work on tax policy, never a dull moment.
Rachel Snyderman, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
That was Rachel Snyderman, Managing Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. The difficulty predicting the economic trajectory and the fiscal deficit is nothing new, but Rachel points out how sensitive the federal budget is now to changes in interest rates because of how large the outstanding debt is. Small increases in Treasury yields can swamp any changes to discretionary spending or tax policy in determining the size of budget outlays, and Treasury yields are only indirectly within the federal government's control. We'll see a handful of June inflation data next week by the way of the CPI, PPI, and import price index releases. The consensus expectation is for the core CPI to increase 0.3% and raise the year-on-year rate from 2.8% to 2.9%. Investors and the Fed have been waiting to see tariff impacts show up in price indices, but inflation has so far been consistently timid since February. Also next week, the June retail sales will round out the last month of Q2 retail spending data. Consumers have tried to avoid tariffs this year by front-running policy or postponing spending, leading to significantly volatile monthly changes in spending the last 6 months. Unadjusted for inflation, control group spending is expected to increase 0.4%. The following week, new home sales and durable goods orders will round out Q2 GDP estimates before the advanced release comes out July 30th. A few Fed officials are on the calendar next week before the pre-meeting communications blackout begins July 19th. Any substantively new commentary is likely to be a reaction to next week's CPI or retail sales data. The bond market is currently pricing in essentially no possibility of a rate cut at the Fed meeting later this month. Chair Powell is also scheduled to speak at a regulatory conference on July 22nd during the blackout period where he, according to the Fed's guidelines, will not comment on near-term rate policy. That's all for today's episode. Thanks again for listening. I'm Will Compernell, macro strategist with FHN Financial. This episode was edited by Bill Stanfield. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Simply Put wherever you get your podcasts. Email simplyput@fhnfinancial.com with any questions or comments. This podcast is presented for informational purposes only and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase or sale of any security. Views expressed herein accurately reflect the speaker's personal views about the data, news, trends, events, etc. discussed herein or any subject securities or issuers. No part of their compensation was, is, or will be, directly or indirectly, related to any specific recommendations or views expressed. FHN Financial, through First Horizon Bank or its affiliates, offers investment products and services. Investment products are not FDIC insured, have no bank guarantee, and may lose value.